Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming on over to our Bible study tonight for chapter 10 of Managing Church Conflicts. I'm excited again. We have some really good conversations here, and I hope that you are all being blessed with the conversations with the pastor and the first lady in the first hour. And we're going to go on now and try to apply some of those things that we have learned over the course of the past few weeks and months. And now we're going to go into our managing church conflict. So tonight we're going to be doing the topic is step 3: constraining strategies, coaching principles. And before I get started, I do want to, we're going to have a word of prayer, but let the record reflect that the pastor and the first lady did put it. Don't turn the microphone down. I see your hand on the microphone. Let the record reflect that the pastor and first lady had an opportunity to showcase themselves on with their shirts. And you know that I'm in the studio. That's all right. I'm in the studio as well. And as you notice, I didn't get a shirt. But that's all right.
Kaylani said she want one too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm in here with them in close proximity, and I don't have a shirt. But you know what? That's all right. I want the record to reflect that no merch was ordered for me. Merch or merc or whatever it is. I'll get it right when I get a shirt. And since I haven't gotten one, I'm just saying. I'm just telling the church no.
Now you only tell half the story. You know, tell the whole story as to why. Okay, it's all good.
First, I only knew the backstory. This is my joke hour right now. This comedy time. And I was saying I didn't get a shirt, but that's all right. I still love the pastor and the first lady anyway.
We love you too.
So this evening, again, we're going to be doing chapter 10. I forgot that quick. Isn't that terrible? I forgot that quick, and the book is open with chapter 10 right in front of me. I don't know what my problem is today. I've been forgetting stuff all day today. But let us have a word of prayer. Dear God, we come to you this evening to say thank you. Lord, we are just grateful for everything that you have just done today for us, opening our eyes and just starting our day off and allowing us to come together as a congregation to learn more about you and to just have fellowship. Lord, we need the fellowship, oh God, because there's so much going on in this world. But there's one thing that I'm sure about is that you are always consistent. And Lord, I thank you every Wednesday that we have this opportunity to come together. Lord, continue to bless those who are on the line, those who are going to come in to watch, those who will watch at a later time. Lord, we just say thank you right now for them. This we ask in your name. Thank God.
Thank God.
Amen. So as I mentioned today, I had the opportunity to get my vaccination. And when I was there, I was a little nervous. I'm not nervous about getting the shot. But when I was like, you know what? There are going to be side effects to this vaccination, but they walk you through the whole process. You sign all these forms and things of that nature. And I just said to myself, you know what, God, I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to get this shot, but I'm grateful for, the knowledge you have put into people to develop this vaccination so that we could go back to some semblance of normalcy. So I'm just grateful to God because he has done so much for all of us throughout this pandemic and will continue to do for us. And I think that it's important that every day we wake up with a state of gratitude for the blessings that he's bestowed to us. But not only that we praise him for just being who he is, because he is certainly very, very good to each one of us. And so when we get in tonight about coaching principles, tonight Dr. Halverstead is really talking about the principal players. And what he's referring to is, how do you coach a person to handle a conflict? There are principal players, and we talked about fair fighting and dirty fighting last week. We talked about a lot of different strategies to deal with the communal players. We talked about different ways of saying things that sometimes triggers people, just how our words are going about. And so it was very interesting that, he talks about the coaching of the players and about it's important that when you are dealing with the principals concentrate actually on the conflict rather than the players. Meaning that once you're in a conflict, don't start hammering each other, but just concentrate on the actual conflict. It's easy. The first example that he gives in the very beginning of the chapter, he talks about how someone calls the pastor really upset about another lay leader, lays in to this lay leader. The lay leader is not doing what they need to do, and really just starts to tell the pastor, you better get over here and handle the situation before it gets worse. And so then the pastor gets another phone call from the lay leader, and the pastor had to, and this is any principal player, did not engage in the back and forth with the players, but let's rather just get to the actual conflict. What is the actual issue? Is the issue that, something's going on in the church? It's not right. It's not about the back and forth, the give and take, but it's actually just about the actual problem that was taking place. So he goes on to say that in this model that the principal player is not adversarial. That means the manager does not take on the principal to make them in charge, but rather they seek to confront. They do not seek to confront, cajole, beg, persuade, reason, or convict the principals so that they change, but rather they come in to handle the situation and just deal with the actual conflict. So tonight he talks about coaching, how the principal comes into the conflict. The principal comes in by having a one-on-one dialogue or a one-on-one caucus is strictly off the record. That means if the pastor was talking to the lay leader and the person who had the member who was upset, that's an opportunity for him to talk to that. He should talk to that person to see exactly what the conflict is, but to engage them in a way that it's going to resolve the conflict, not add more fuel to the fire. So let's use a more practical example. You have your children who come to you. You're a parent, or let's say your parent. You have a daughter and a son. The son comes to you to say, my sister is doing this to me. And the sister probably did it, and vice versa. But as a parent, you don't want to add more gasoline to the fire. What you try to do is you try to say, how am I going to resolve this situation? Because if I don't resolve it, if I add more fuel, it's just going to be more work for me. So what happens is you have a one-on-one conversation and say, okay, your sister may be doing this. How could you handle the situation? And vice versa. Your brother may be doing this, but how can you handle it? Don't say, well, I know that's your brother's character, so you should just go ahead and accept it. That's adding fuel to the fire. Oh, that's what your sister does. She's having a bad day. No, you have to actually go through and work through the conflict. So the principle the person has a real important role of going to the two people who are suffering from the conflict and really working them on a one-on-one basis to get to the issue without causing more damage or more, violence or whatever in between the two people. And that's what's really important, that you have that dialogue and you get to the actual resolution. So coaching involves honestly affirming them as God's loved one. This is what we have to do in church. That people change by being validated, and when they feel worthwhile, that they're lovable, that they're capable, and that they're their responsible selves. They did not change they don't change by being invalidated, by being called worthless, disgusting, helpless, defective, or irregular. But what they start to do is when you start to validate them and say that they're God's child, that we're going to resolve this, people start to feel a sense of confidence that they're able to, I'm able to deal with the situation. I'm able to come forward. I'm able to really work with the person because you know what? I know whose I am. And once I know whose I am, I'm able to go into the situation and say, look, I know we're having our differences, but this is what we're doing all this for God. So when we're doing it for God, that means we have to get along and we can resolve the conflict without calling each other names, without going, like, as we talked about last week, going behind the person's back and start talking all this nonsense to other people so they start to believe it. Also, we talked about this evening. It's really about talking to the person, validating that their concerns are, they have concerns, that you acknowledge there's a conflict, and how are we going to resolve the conflict? That's important. I think, we've been going through this whole book, and I hope that, we're learning from Dr. Haverstadt that we are going to experience conflict. There's no way of getting around conflict, but it's how do you manage that? As the title of the book, how do you manage the conflict? How do you engage with one another in a way that's respectful, realizing that everyone is God's child? You know that we don't always get along, but how do we resolve it so that the solution, it's a win-win for each. It's not a win-lose, but a win-win for all of us. And once we get to the place of a win-win, then it's a great experience that, you know what, I heard your side, you respected me, and vice versa. But now I know where the problem, where the problem came from, and now it's time for us to work together. So he also goes on to say that a coaching strategy for the principal is to offer that therapeutic, almost like a therapeutic report we used to talk about in my last job, is that you come in there and you try to reduce the tension, reduce the anxiety people may be having, reduce the anger that people are having. But he also goes to say that it's therapeutic, but it's not therapy. Don't try to come in with going back 5 years from every situation, but just deal with the current situation and let's resolve that. That's how you reduce it. So you can't say, "Oh, I'm having a conflict, but you know what? Let me add in what he or she did to me 2 weeks ago." No, let's talk about the current conflict. If there is right now in real time, how do we deal with that? So Halberstadt is saying a lot that, we have to deal with how we have to be coaches in conflict. And when I was reading this, I wrote down a note that, in the NFL, what typically happens, and the pastor and I like football, when one team is up in the first lady, well, the Giants really don't count, so that's why I kind of left them out. But
the Jets are what?
So I left that out. But in football, on any level, we all enjoy football. In any level of football, typically what happens if one team is leading in the first half, they always say, Bill Belichick is really good for saying this, I could have coached better. I have to go back. He goes into the locker room, whatever his method is, and they make the adjustments so that they can come out. And I don't like the Patriots, but I'm just using Bill Belichick as an example. They come back out and they have made the adjustments. So what he has done and his staff has done is they have gone in there and they have started to work out the issue. They're talking about the real-time issue that's going on. They're losing the game. They're not talking about the previous game or the games that are ahead of them. They're talking about the current game. And so when I was reading that, that's the analogy that God gave me. He said, we have to talk about the current conflict. Don't go back to the previous conflict or the conflicts that may come forward we're talking about right now. And how do we make the adjustments right now? And the adjustments start to happen that we have to speak to the players involved to tell them what their responsibility is and what the actual objective is. And the objective is to win. And if we're going to win, we have to work together as a team. And that's really what is important. And a lot of us, we want to operate on an island, and you can't do that when you're on a team. We are a team. So now we have to make the adjustments. We have to deal with the conflict. I can't go over and pout for 4 quarters because guess what? I'm going to lose the game. We have to play the game and we have to make the adjustments. And so tonight, Halverstadt is saying that we all are coaches. If I see a teammate of mine going through something or causing a conflict with someone else, it's my responsibility now. I put on that coach's hat to go over and say, look, hey, let's make these adjustments. I know there's a problem, but we have a game. And our objective is to win and teach people about Jesus Christ. And if we have so much internal conflict going on, how much Jesus is being talked about? How much Jesus is being learned, how much Jesus is being shown if we are always fighting one another. And that is not a place that we need to be in the church. We are there to love one another, not always fight and tear people down, but rather if you see issue, you correct it, you move forward, and you let God work things out. So Halverstadt really in these 10 chapters has been telling us we have a responsibility when a conflict happens not to let it fester and to continually grow, but adjust it. Because guess what? Next week, we're on to the next game, the next playbook that we have to do. And I just hope that we understand that it's important to make those corrections right away. So again, he says not therapy. So we have the football analogy, which I thought was pretty good. I didn't come up with that myself. God laid that on me. So thank you, God. I just signed for it, and I appreciate that. But I say, you know what? I might, although I won't talk about my team, but
we on here talking about it for you.
I know that's right. So he goes on to say also is that it's important that remembering faith means a coaching strategy. We have to remember that when we are dealing with people in the church, we're supposed to be, I would hope, Christian, Christ-like. I would hope that. And that for Christians, self-love and self-trust are not necessarily learned human capacities in a mean world. Self-love and self-respect are seen as gifts from a gracious God who restores us within us the capacity to accept forgiveness and to learn respect and value ourselves as God's respected and as God respects and values us. He goes on to say, as John put it, beloved, let us love one another. We all know this, right? Because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is what? Love. In this love, not that in this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent us his son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sin. 1 John 4, 7, and 10. So what Halvard is teaching us tonight, that it's a combination. We're coming here that we have to understand that we got to love ourselves. And when we love ourselves, we love others. You are going to have conflict, but you got to have love in the midst of the conflict. For God is what? He is love. And so tonight it's important that whatever we're going through in our life, whatever conflict that may happen in the church, because we're talking about managing church conflict, that you still have the love for that person. There is nothing that can be so egregious that you stop loving someone, because if you do that, you're going against what God has taught us, which is God is love. He loves us. He forgives us. He accepts us. He shows us value. He gives us blessing. He gives us grace. He is sufficient for all of us. So how can I say I don't love my brother or sister for whatever they have done? No, I have an obligation. This is something that we are getting from God, that I have an obligation to forgive and to accept forgiveness, because that is what it is all about. So Halverstad really today is giving us some great points. He also goes on to say he talks about caring for people. In the midst of, we talk about faith, it's important that God is love, but it's also important that you care for people. So he said, to care for another person, I must be able to understand the other and that one's world as I were inside. So that means you have to understand the person. You have to take time. We talked about earlier today about doing the work to understand relationships. Instead of merely looking at the other in a detached way from outside, as if the other were a specimen, I must be able to be with the other in that one's world. You have to go to the place where they are so that you understand who they are. And being with that other, I do not lose myself. I know this is really powerful. I don't lose myself. Seeing the other's world as it appears to that one does not mean having the other's reaction to it. And thus I'm able to help the other in the other's world, something the other is unable to do for him or herself. Amen. That was deep. You got to understand where they're coming from so that you can be able to help them. Amen. But in order to be able to help them, you got to do the work to get to know them. Yes. We always are so quick to dismiss people when we get upset, and we don't want to do the work to get to know the personality or where they are. In order to care for someone, what's that saying, First Lady? Because you say it all the time, and I never get it right. People don't know that you care until you show them. What is it?
Yeah, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care.
Absolutely. That sums up what he's saying. You have to be able to go in and do the work, to go into that person's world, to understand. And it's not to go into the person's world to start attacking them, but rather to see where they are. So when you see where they are, you can know, well, I understand now how they react. I understand how they came to this conflict because I am now in the world. And now when I'm in the world, I don't lose myself when I walk into their world. I know who I am in God, but what I'm going to be able to do now is help them because I have a better understanding of exactly where they are. But we have to be able to do the work. And if we are not willing to do the work, the conflict starts to mount up each time. So it's really, really important. Do the work. Amen. So he goes on to say coaching principles involves that kind of caring. By standing with principles, a coach helps. This is our job. A coach helps them to learn to stand up for themselves and fight what? Fair, in a fair way. That's what it's about. Fair. Fighting fair. Finally, a coaching principle strategy reflects a Christian understanding that being human involves harboring both fair and dirty fighting proclivities. As James, the reputed brother of Jesus, put it when describing principles in the primitive church fights, he says, "For the same mouth comes blessing and cursing. Who is wise and understands among you? So be your good life, show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. Yeah. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambitions in your heart, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be what? Disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a partiality of hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. And a harvest of righteousness is sown righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within what? You. That's James 3:10. It goes on. So the conflicts that we have, the problems that we have with others, the last part says it's because the war within you, the cravings within you to start to really bring those other things out because you have not dealt with yourself. And so when we go back to caring for others, we see issues. We have to go back and step into that person's world, but we also have to understand that we play a large role in how we handle conflicts. And if we don't deal with the war within ourselves, we are not going to be successful in any aspect of our life. You've got to do the work on yourself, because if not, it starts to spill over into a lot of different things. You have to work at it. It's hard. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's not. It is very difficult. We do react a lot. We react a lot because it's easy to do, because we rather not do the work.
That's right.
So he goes on to say that we also got to be careful about, we have to deputize bystanders as coaches. Meaning when you see someone who's on the outside who knows the conflict, start coaching them and say, hey, this is how you resolve conflict. Don't just stand there and be a spectator, but actually get involved and start to undertake the problem. And you start to coach them by ministering to them. You start telling them that they're valued, that their job is to help restore and bring love forward. You have to start doing the work. So then he goes on, we go on, he says, so basically in that chapter, he says, recruit bystanders to undertake a coaching principle strategy with another principle. What he says is, he's very clear about this. The deputized coach is not to represent. So when you call a bystander into the conflict, they're not there to represent, report, or advocate in any way. But what they're there to do is help resolve the issues and understand the issues or the interests of the person. The deputized coach is to keep and complete confidence in information shared about the principal's interests and issue. The deputized coach will report back to the manager and principal only the coach's perception of the principal's fair or dirty fighting rating as the outcome of the coaching process. So that person when you deputize a bystander, understand what their role is. They're not going there to add more fuel to the fire, but what they're going there to do is to really understand the issue and the interest so that they can help with the manager to resolve the problem that's going on. So, he goes on to say, securing coaching for oneself as a manager. He says it's a necessity for a manager to stay in touch. This was really important when you're trying to resolve an issue. To stay in touch with his or her own feelings. You got to be able to know how you feel, because if you start to push those feelings on someone else, it starts to create more issues. So be in touch with who you are and what you're bringing to the situation. Self-coaching is different from self-talk. Self-talk can occur in front of a mirror. Self-coaching requires the participation of other human beings. Many church leaders, especially pastors, resist seeking to be coached by another person. They may think of coaching as an admission of inadequacy, or they may think of coaching as risking a vulnerability to their fear. But it's important that when you're self-coaching, when you are going through this process, that you are engaging with others so that you can become who you need to be. So this chapter tonight has been very, very opening. So Haversack goes on to give us some models of coaching preaching strategies. He says you have to identify fair fighting proclivities. He also talks about you have to identify dirty fighting proclivities. That means you have to understand where each person is coming from. You have to be proactive. He goes on to say that, he gives some examples of topics that may be, that might develop, that might show what dirty fighting proclivities might be. He said updating the principal's gut theology that is preventing his or her constructive assertion of self, such as learning not to play victim, blame others, make enemies, or discount positive feedback. Dispelling a principal's unexamined unconscious fears from previous life experiences now past. For example, fearing physical harm from adult confrontation with others because of the experience of physical abuse as a child. These are things that start happening when people start fighting dirty because they know past history of a person. Appropriating new, strange, or different ways of thinking or seeing things as principles, such as learning to accept change without losing self. That is so important. You can go through a change without losing who you are. The change is going to be beneficial. Doesn't mean you got to really go through the change to understand. You have to know who you are first. He goes on to say, such as learning to accept without losing self, learning that God does not need to be defended. Learning that compromise is not a betrayal. Identifying, I like that when we say God does not need to be defended. People always say, well, God told me to tell you. We hear that a lot of times. And my thing is, and the first thing that you talked about this in Sunday school, again, say exactly what God tells you to say. Amen. But you don't have to preface it all the time by saying God told me to tell you. Just say it. And the person will know that it's been confirmed because God tells you first. I got a little excited there, but just say it. Got a little excited there to me. So recognize and breaking free from a principal's form of distorted thinking, such as all or nothing ways of thinking, either or ways of thinking, overgeneralizations in thinking, negative mental filtering that picks up only one negative aspect of a person's situation, losing realistic perspectives. So again, you have to understand, we got to go back that sometimes we have a tendency to go right to the negative and not find anything about the positive. But if you know who you are, you don't have to worry about that. So refrain from fair fighting behaviors. He also talked about rehearse fair fighting behaviors. He talks about that today. And lastly, commit to fair fighting behaviors. And he talks about, it's important during the fair fighting that you really understand that you have to be consistent in all approaches in resolving the conflict. Don't just start one day and just stop, but continually work at it that the problem is resolved. So tonight, that was Halverstadt. There were some really, the key thing I really want to talk about is that we to cover tonight is about the loving one another, for God is love. And that in every conflict, go back to that. What is the real issue? What are our interests? And knowing that God loves us and we have a responsibility to love one another. So we have an obligation. I say it's an obligation to resolve the conflict. Don't let things linger for long periods of time, but rather keep on working at it. Work at it hard so that you are able to resolve those conflicts. And conflicts, I've experienced this recently that you have to have, it's funny. In my job, I can have any conversation with anybody because you know what? I'm in charge. I can have the tough conversations. It's not, I can go back to easily say, this is the policy, this is the procedure, you have not followed it. And it may be uncomfortable for the person, but that's my job to go ahead and say it. But personally, it's hard having those tough conversations to resolve conflict. But in order to resolve the conflict, I have to be self-reflective of myself. What am I giving off that's causing the conflict to happen all the time? And I'm going to have to work on strategies to really understand that I am the problem, and some of you are too. Let's be honest about that. That's the problem. I'm not going to be the one who up here confessions all day today. That we are a problem, but we really have to get to why do we have those underlying issues? Why are we the way we are? And not only that, being able to go to and reason with our brother and our sister to have those tough conversations. It's hard, but I tell you, it's worth it in the end, because not only have you grown, but you have now come closer to your brother and your sister by saying, you know what? I know I have a problem and I'm willing to work at it. And I need you to help me. I need you to help me along the way that I may be able to do those things. And I hope tonight that, you are reading the book. I hope that you're using some of the strategies that we have been learning in the past 10 chapters. Really, if you've really been reading and you really understand the course that we've been going through, it's about really self-reflection and how can I change? And we all can change. We all have work that we need to do. We are all striving to be better. And in order to do that, you have to have tough conversations with yourself. What triggers you? And I know, I'll use this example. I was thinking about this example. Some of the things that trigger. This is a really elementary example, but it's just funny. When I was growing up, my sister was afraid of the dark. It wasn't me. It was my sister. I'm not going to say which one it was. It was my sister who was afraid of the dark. Yeah. And yeah, she was afraid of the dark. And in my great grandma's old house, before she had the remodeling done, you had to go outside to get into the garage. She had a refrigerator in the garage. And I would say to my sister, because I wasn't doing it, and I said, can you go outside to get this stuff that Mom wants at this time? And she was like petrified of going outside in the dark. And I understood why is she so scared of the dark? I never understood why she was so afraid of it. But then again, we lived in White Sparks, was the darkest area in Browns Mills. But it came to, I now understood it because when she was staying in the room, my other sister would just turn off the lights, just scare all the time. So there was a trigger for why she wanted to go out. And so now I start to understand, like, now I get it why she doesn't want to go out there, because she's afraid, because she feels like she's by herself. She because she went back to that moment. And so in order for her to get past it, to say, you know what, I'm going to walk out here with you. I'm going to go, there's nothing to be afraid about it. But again, I had to step into her world. to understand why she felt the way she did. And then once I was able to reassure her and say I'm with her, she was more comfortable going outside also. So that was just like I said, elementary example. But I say that all to say is that we do have a responsibility for our brother and our sister to understand what makes them trigger. But when we find it out, that we don't use it against them to hurt them even further. But what we do is we work with them so that they can grow from it, because we all need growth. So again, thank you tonight for joining in. Thank you all for carrying over to Bible study. I do like seeing everyone and seeing the comments and that are there. And I hope to see you next week. And I really do. I'm very, very serious about this. I hope next Wednesday when I get here, next Wednesday, that I have a shirt. So thank you. The pastor tried to mute me, but it didn't work. I mean, I hope that I have a shirt next week. But thank you all for joining. I hope to see you next week and have a good rest of the week. See you on Sunday for Sunday school and for our Sunday morning service.